This is a picture, NETANYAHU, who was the leader of that raid. He gave his life over there, and we have with him his brother, who's a former Israeli army officer and executive board member of the Jonathan Institute on World Terrorism in Jerusalem. Would you please welcome to the 700 Club, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm so glad to have you. Listen, your brother was a hero. What made him tick? Why did he feel the way he did about Israel?
Well, he didn't think that he was fighting just Israel's war in the now and present. He viewed himself as a link in the chain, as he called it, of Israel's historic struggle, the historic struggle of the Jewish people to return to their homeland, and once returned, to secure it for future generations. And he really thought of himself in those terms. And I think he drew inspiration from the Bible, from the biblical heroes.
Yes.
The kings, these people were alive for him, and he followed their example.
Well, I understand that he took his troops by those sites and said, now here's where David fought, or here's where the Maccabees fought.
He used to stop in marches, or in the middle of exercises, when they'd come to a site of an ancient battle, and he would show the troops. He'd never force people to listen. He said, those of you who are not tired, come with me, and I'll tell you something about this place and what happened here. And he did that again and again throughout the years and touched hundreds and thousands of people in Israel with that kind of evocation of the historic spirit of ancient Israel.
Well, now, at his funeral, Moshe Dayan wept. What did he tell you about your brother?
He came to us, tears streaming down his face, and he said, I have to tell you something quite extraordinary. He had given a book to publication 2 weeks before, when Yoni was still alive and still a secret man. He was the head of the Israeli anti-terrorist elite unit, and he was a secret man. But Moshe Dayan said, I must write about this man. I must tell the world about him. I won't say his name. I'll just call him Yoni without saying the last name. And he wrote about an episode in the Yom Kippur War where Yoni rescued a wounded soldier under fire and was decorated for it. And he finishes the description in his book. I do not know how many men there are like Yoni in Israel, but I'm sure we have enough to ensure that Israel meets the grim tests that face her in the future.
Well, now, in your life, you're sort of in the Jonathan Institute. That's named after your brother, Yoni. And you have begun to expose to the world the source of terrorism, because he was in the anti-terrorist organization. And Israel seemed to be the first nation that was willing to stand up to terrorism and go in with guns blazing into this petty dictator, Idi Amin, and rescue your people. What is the source of terrorism? What have you found about it?
Well, the more we looked, the more we found out that terrorist incidents and terrorist groups are not just isolated, random groups around the world, that there is a major force behind most of these groups, and that is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has been arming systematically most of the terrorist groups that operate against the West. They've been training them on its own soil and on countries that are aligned to the Soviet Union. They've been giving them money, they've been giving them diplomatic pouches, safe havens, and so on. If you take away the Soviet Union and its chief proxy, the PLO, international terrorism would collapse. It would cease to be so menacing.
You mean to tell me the PLO, now, on this broadcast the other day, I said the PLO were terrorists. A PLO called us and said, we're not terrorists, we're freedom fighters for liberty and so forth. You're saying that the PLO are the major conduit of terrorism from the Soviet Union?
Yes, yes. It's not the only conduit, because Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Cuba are obviously very important additional proxies.
All right, now what facts do you have to back that up? Because you had a seminar, Jack Kemp and others were there, and you showed the world the reality. Now, what did you show them? What is your factual basis?
Well, there have been, as early as 1969, 50 camps inside the Soviet bloc, 40 of them in the Soviet Union, that trained terrorists. This was revealed by the Israeli chief of intelligence. But more importantly, the terrorists themselves have spoken in several interviews now that have been filmed and shown in the West of their training in the Soviet Union, Arab terrorists described that there were other terrorists from other countries there. And finally, after this public exposure, the dam burst loose. And in September 29th, 1979, the PLO observer in the UN said, this is all true. The Soviet Union is training and our boys, as they call it, in our military academies. And
he admitted it in the United Nations?
Yes, yes, he did.
Well,
in a PBS interview, in fact.
That's a shocking interview. Well, now let me ask you this. The Saudis are supposedly the friends of the United States, and they're supposed to be Western-oriented, and yet the Saudi Arabia gives $100 million a year to the PLO. Now, Prince Fahd says, well, the reason we do that is so we can have some control over them. If we didn't give any, we wouldn't have any control. Well, now, how much can you do with $100 million in a terrorist camp?
Well, I think that they're paying basically blackmail money. They're not having any control whatsoever. The people who control the PLO, if at all, are the Soviets and not the Saudis. What the Saudis are doing is funneling paradoxically, the main force that operates today outside the organized armies of the Soviet bloc against the Western interest and American interest, and that's the PLO.
What do they plan to do with terrorism? What is the ultimate strategy?
It's to destabilize and to weaken and to terrorize every country in the West, every American interest, every American economic base outside the United States. It's to make America withdraw from various parts of the world and feel that it simply cannot deal with this type of malignant disease that is spreading.
So in other words, the kidnapping of General Dozier, the attack on the commanding officer in Germany, all these things are part of a pattern. Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, the Red Brigade in Italy, these other terrorist organizations are all interconnected and all with one central goal.
Well, there certainly is a great deal of Soviet involvement with all of these groups. And the objective invariably is not to attack Bulgaria. It's not to attack Budapest. It's always American targets or Western targets or what they call the Zionist imperialist conspiracy.
What do the people in Israel feel about the United States when some of our business interests loan credits and machinery and technology, and we sell grain and we loan money to the Soviet bloc? What does Israel think about that?
Well, I could say what I think about it.
What do you think about it?
What I think many of my countrymen think about it. We have a feeling that America is almost following Lenin's dictum, that they will give the Russians or the communists the rope from which they'll fashion a noose to hang themselves. Not the communists, but to hang the capitalists. You can't have it both ways. If a major power is set out to dominate you, to take over every one of your positions, literally to take over the world, you cannot at the same time give it the tools and the means to do so. You must make a decision what your foreign policy should be like.
What do you think is going to happen in southern Lebanon, Syria, and that sector? That seems to be the most explosive. Did you think Israel might well take a preemptive first strike against the PLO in Lebanon and try to eliminate them there?
I think more than anything else, the events in that local region will be determined by the policies of the United States. You may ask, why do I say that? There's a tremendous armament going on there, an arming of the Syrian army, which is now armed to the teeth with Soviet weapons and is poised to do the Soviets' bidding anywhere in the Middle East. The same has been happening with the PLO. This is a threat not only to Israel, but to the whole those few remaining positions in the Middle East which are still affiliated with the West. If the Soviets choose to move these forces, they may get an advantage. Israel can stop them, or at least can pose a credible threat to stopping them, provided the United States backs it up. And in order to have that backing, we have to have public understanding, both in the general public here and in Washington.
Is there any possibility that the Soviets themselves would reinforce the Syrians? Say the Syrians launched another war, they came through the Golan area, they broke out of those positions. Do you think the Soviets would actually pour in their own manpower to back them up in that?
I think they'd be wary of doing that because they know that Israel, unlike most of the other countries, will fight and fight vigorously. The Soviets at one point in 1970 flew missions for an Arab country, and they were immediately shot down. 4 pilots were shot down by our pilots. So I would think that they'd hesitate in moving their own troops in there because they know they'd meet with very firm and determined resistance.
We have a clip, we understand, that shows some of the principles of terror and some of the terrorist activity around the world, things that are happening in this very important area to all of us. Tell us, this is, who are these people we're looking at now?
Well, that's a picture of my brother. He's being decorated here by the Chief of Staff. Here he's with a battalion. This is an interview, brief interview that he gave to Israeli television while he was a battalion commander on the Golan Heights. This is a scene from his funeral, which was attended by about 10,000 people, including, of course, all the leaders of Israel. Yoni touched many, many people in his life, and it turns out after his death, with the publication of the book of his letters, he's now touching thousands of people. There is Shimon Peres,
I see him.
and Mr. Rabin, and Dayan is there too. I don't know if the camera can see him. It was a very moving funeral, but we're gratified by the response of readers around the world to Yoni's letters, and we see through it that his legacy, his life, his character lives on.
Well, he was the only person that died in the Entebbe raid, the only one of the Israeli soldiers.
That's correct. He used to say that any mediocre commander could win a victory if he sacrificed enough men, but that wasn't his approach. He said that the test of a real commander is to win victory with a minimum of casualties. And in fact, in all his battles, and there were dozens and dozens of battles in 3 wars, he always achieved the mission and won the victory with isolated, minimal casualties. And in Entebbe, too,
incredible.
He was the only casualty.
Well, now, in Entebbe, speaking about the terrorism and going back to that, now, that was the result of a hijacked situation that was supposedly terrorist, and yet Idi Amin welcomed them and gave them a sanctuary. Now, was this a PLO operation or something else?
Well, it was much broader than just a PLO operation. There were West Germans there. It wasn't just Arabs. Several of the terrorists were West German. There was a West German woman there. Idi Amin was the head of a government, a crazy, demented government, but the head of a government that was in complete cahoots with the terrorists. They were met there. His soldiers guarded the airport. They posed sentries around the terminal, not to threaten the terrorists, but to prevent any rescue mission from taking place.
Yes.
So this showed that the fabric of international terrorism goes beyond just one group, or it's a connection of these various groups, and they all have one thing in common. They're all deeply hostile. I would say they hate anything that smacks of democracy, of freedom, of liberty as we know it. And that's why they hate Israel so much, because it represents those values that they know they don't have in their countries.
And when it's finally said, ladies and gentlemen, our natural ally in the Middle East is Israel, because Israel and the United States share centuries of tradition, of freedom, of society, of religion, of common heritage. This is, in essence, a free Western country with parties, with democracy, with voting, with a freely elected government. You don't have that. These other places are dictators, they're kings, they're police states, etc. This is the only real, true bastion of freedom in the entire area that would be comparable to a so-called Western democracy, and it is our most natural ally. Do you feel in the coming, well, there have been some spats as if between friends with the Reagan administration and the present government of Israel. Do you think it's going to be a coming together? I feel that that's going to happen, that there's going to be a rapprochement that will draw the two countries closer together. Did you see that or not?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think that Mr. Reagan himself seems to have, I would say, the right instincts. He seems to have a real sympathy and understanding of what Israel represents and its value as an ally to America. I think he's getting bad advice, if I can speak diplomatically. Yeah. And I think the policy of trying to appease the Saudi Arabians at any cost is quite frankly ludicrous. It's funny, because they are completely dependent on you. You can tell them to do anything you want. They cannot live, they cannot have their technology, they cannot eat a meal without America. So the situation is really opposite to what exists. You can tell them what to do instead of they're telling you
there's never been a history of any nation in the world with no armor and no military that has been allowed to extort $200 to $300 billion from another nation in history. This has never happened before, where an undefended nation relies on the armament of the people they're taking the money from. And that's really what OPEC has done when they raised the oil prices. But we won't go into that in any great length right now. But this is a book that our guest has written, the letters of Jonathan, his brother, Netanyahu, a self-portrait of a hero. This is something you might enjoy reading, and our deep appreciation to his brother Benjamin Netanyahu for being here with us from Israel. And thank you, and shalom. God bless you.